Okay, we've just been looking at this German term, Bejahung, this affirmation, primitive affirmation, something that goes back to the beginning of a child's socialization. And we talked about this as an acceptance of the symbolic universe, an acceptance of the fact that the child is thrust, dropped, kicked into a world of symbols and rules and order and others that is not of their own creation. In other words, a world that is in which they are alienated, I think is fair to say. In the beginning, on page 82, Lacan says, then there is either Bejahung, where all of this occurs and you accept the fact that you are alienated in this world, not of your own creation, which is the affirmation of what is, in this case, a world not of your own creation, or Verwerfung, which is where you deny all of this. Now, go up a little bit on page 82. First full paragraph. At the level of this pure primitive Bejahung, which may or may not take place, an initial dichotomy is established. What has been subject to Bejahung, to primitive symbolization, will have various destinies. What has come under the influence of the primitive Verwerfung will have another. So what Lacan is here suggesting is that depending on whether and to what extent you accept and affirm your alienation in the symbolic, there will be futures that unfold for you. One is the path of the neurotic, the other is the path of the psychotic. Let's look first at the path of the neurotic. I say this is the normal person, again, not to suggest that this is a good person, but to suggest that it is a typical person. If you look around the room, most of the people that you see are going to be neurotic. There may even be 0 in the room that are psychotic. Most people are neurotic, and that's what I mean when I refer to this as a normal structure. Page 83. So, within Bejahung, all sorts of accidents occur. Okay, so here we are. We're working on the topic of neurosis first, to understand what happens for the neurotic in order to help us better understand what doesn't happen for the psychotic. So within Bejahung, all sorts of accidents occur. Page 83. There is no indication that the primitive retrenchment has been done cleanly. This primitive retrenchment, that's what Bejahung points to. Besides, there is a strong chance that in the long term, we will know nothing about the motives for it, precisely because it is situated beyond all mechanisms of symbolization. Beyond all mechanisms of symbolization. There's something mystical about what's happening here. It's not too hard to wrap your head around, but there is something challenging about this. The structure of this primitive Bejahung is logical, not temporal. And now what he's saying is that it's occurring beyond all mechanisms of symbolization. So wait a minute. He's telling me that there is a primitive symbolization, on page 82, that is situated beyond all mechanisms of symbolization? What on earth is going on here? We don't yet have an answer to this question. But if we start with our understanding of castration, of the prohibition that the name of the father, the no of the father, introduces into the child's life, we have a sense of this. No matter what the word is that the parent or primary caregiver wants the child to use instead of their cry, the child experiences the introduction of that word as a negation, as a commandment, as a prohibition. Thou shalt not continue crying. So whatever that word is, it could be please and thank you. Whatever the word is, the child experiences it as a big no, a prohibition. And what does it prohibit? It prohibits the child from remaining in a world where they think the only option available to them is to cry and get what they want. It's a prohibition against their ability to remain babies. And it's that prohibition that the psychotic rejects. They refuse to accept that. The neurotic person, however, accepts it and now learns to live in a split way. I say split because on the one hand, they still remain these primitive biological beings with the urge to cry when they don't get what they want, to bang on the walls when they feel frustrated, to do all of the primitive baby-like things that we used to do when we were that age. But they also know, here's the other part of that split, that they are socialized, that they live in a civilization, that they are not just biological beings, but also sociological beings, beings subject to language, rules, laws, order, and that is another option. Instead of banging on the wall, you can say, "I find your actions quite frustrating, sir." Instead of crying when you don't get what you want, you can say, "Please pass the ketchup, ma'am." You can use language in these ways to get what you want. And the neurotic is somebody that oftentimes struggles with these two options. How to be, let's say, assertive instead of aggressive. How to ask for what you want when you want it instead of waiting until it's too late and then you boil over and issue a screed of demands. The dish in the sink that's been there since the mid-'80s. How to ask whose dish it is in the mid-'80s instead of waiting until 2020 to figure out whose dish it is, when everyone's so dang upset about the dish that you're ready to fight about it. The neurotic is somebody that oftentimes struggles with that split because they know that the world is not as simple as it used to be for them. What's prohibited is the blissful ignorance of the child when the parent says, "No, you have to be integrated into the symbolic." And when you accept that, what you accept is a primitive symbolization of your pre-symbolic state. That's important here. Your primitive symbolization of your pre-symbolic state. You affirm it as no longer, if you want to get a little technical about it. The Bejahung that starts the neurotic process is an affirmation of something that is no longer. It's a primitive affirmation of something that was, and creates a slight separation, slight yet significant separation, significant because full of signifiers. Separation between you as the newly speaking child and the previous version of you, of which you had no knowledge because it was pre-symbolic. You were just a lizard on a rock back then, crying when it hurts and giggling when it don't. Page 83. And if someone does know something about this one day, then there is little chance that he will be an analyst. Ha ha. In any case, it is with what remains that the subject constructs himself a world, and above all, that he situates himself within it. That is, that he manages to be more or less what he has admitted that he was, a man, when he finds himself to be of masculine sex, or conversely, a woman. All right, this gets us back to the basic function of the symbolic. In Seminar 3, Lacan sees the symbolic predominantly as a structuring mechanism. It is a subjectifying mechanism. It puts you in your place. It situates you. In the symbolic, everything has its place, including you. Now, the first part of this important sentence, after "in any case" on page 83, it is with what remains that the subject constructs himself a world. Okay. You're crying all the time. Your primary caregiver says, "Hey, it's time to start using your words." That's prohibition. That's castration. That's the no of the father, the name of the father being lowered into your life. And it creates a rupture or a break. The break is simply this. The break is between the world as you knew it before you were told no, and the world as you now know it in the wake of the no. That's the basic split here. It's not just as simple as I'm a biological being, but also a symbolic one. That's common. More primitive, more conceptually precise here is the split that is introduced when language is brought into the child's life is the split between a world that now exists as language and a world that doesn't exist as language. It's a split between the world that was and the world that is now, that didn't exist before then. That's very important here. This is also partly why that world, that primitive world, is logically prior and not temporally prior. Temporally speaking, yes, you were a baby before you became a speaking child. But it wasn't until you became a speaking child that you had any notion of the fact that you were once a baby. When you were a baby, you weren't thinking, I'm a baby and not a speaking child. That ain't how that works. When you're a baby, you are a lizard on a rock. You are in the moment. You are in this blissful Edenic state of pure ignorance, pure need. Only with the introduction of language, only when you start speaking, do you start to have words for things that were no longer. I can remember this, for instance, with my little kiddo, when we started going through her old clothing that she had outgrown. She could remember those items. She could remember wearing those items, but she also knew that she did not fit in them anymore. In this case, the piece of clothing that no longer fit her symbolized a lot. It was symbolic of a world that she once had, but that is now no longer. It was also symbolic of the no longer part, the you can't, the you cannot go back, the you do not fit in these clothes anymore. The part that says to her, that world is gone. It's over. There was a part of you, a being that was you long ago. In her case, just maybe 6 months ago. But for her, that's a long time. Half her life, you think, if she's only one. A being that is no longer. And this item of clothing that is too small for her present body symbolizes this as a reminder, but also as a signifier of loss. That's important here. When the no of prohibition, the no that says now you have to speak like a proper young lady or gentleman, comes to play, what it fundamentally prohibits is any ability to live in a previous state of Edenic bliss. It's a big no to that world. And how that no is metabolized is usually as loss. That world is no longer here anymore. I've lost it. It's gone and it can't be recovered. Not unlike, if you think about it, the lost Edenic paradise that Adam and Eve can no longer return to. Now, what happens when you accept this is what we get to at the second part of page 83. You decide you can no longer go back to Eden, so you're going to try and find your way, find your path, find your place in this world outside of Eden. He situates himself within it. That is, he manages to be more or less what he has admitted that he was. Nice tense here. A man when he finds himself to be of masculine sex, or conversely a woman. In this case, the positionality here is in terms of gender. It can be with regards to anything. Race, class, gender, age, you figure it out. All the isms come to bear here. The symbolic is what helps you accept, emphasis here on more or less, your place in the symbolic. A lot turns on this because the more or less part is crucial. Some people fully embrace the position that the symbolic order, that society, that normativity puts them in. Others do not. Others chafe at it. Your mom and dad may have treated you as a little boy growing up, but that may not have jibed with how you felt. You may not have identified with that subject position. You may not have found yourself there. You may have always refused to allow yourself to be situated there. Nevertheless, there is this world that is constantly trying to funnel you into certain subject positions. And this is where we're going to continue reading on page 83 in a moment.